The council chamber on Karis 9 station looked like a museum of ancient species. Beings from 12 different worlds sat in their designated sections. Some breathing methane, others requiring darkness, all connected through translation fields that hummed with the weight of millions of years of accumulated knowledge. The emergency lights cast red shadows across worried faces, scales, and carapaces. Ralmoth stood at the central podium, his reptilian form towering 3 meters high. His scales had turned gray with age, each one a badge of his 847 years of existence. He had fought in 17 wars, commanded fleets across 30 star systems, and written the defensive doctrines that protected half the galaxy. Now, for the first time in his long life, he felt something he barely recognized. 17 worlds lost, Ralmoth said, his voice deep and measured. 4 species on the brink of extinction. The scourge continues to spread despite our best efforts. The holographic display showed the devastation. Planets that once held billions now stood empty, their surfaces crawling with the metallic darkness of the nanoswarm. The scourge consumed everything organic, learning and adapting with each encounter. It was like fighting an enemy that studied your every move and countered it perfectly. Thexun clicked forward on her 6 legs. The Grolic Prime strategist had lived for 1204 years, and her compound eyes had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations. Her voice came through the translator with mechanical precision. We have deployed the Cartex formation, as perfected over 6 centuries of warfare. It failed within 3 hours. The scourge adapted to our flanking maneuvers before we could execute them. An elder from the Morphean delegation raised one of his 7 tentacles. We attempted the siege protocol, proven effective in 412 previous conflicts. The scourge learned our pattern by the 2nd deployment. Our losses were total. Deho sat quietly in the human section, watching the ancient beings discuss strategies that had been refined over millennia. At 24 years old, he was the youngest diplomat in the chamber by approximately 700 years. Most species didn't even allow their youth to speak in public until they reached their 1st century. The other delegates barely acknowledged the human presence. Next to him, Hagen reviewed tactical data on her tablet. At 22, she had already seen more combat than most species experienced in their first 300 years. Her fingers moved quickly, analyzing patterns in the scourge attacks that the elder races seemed to miss. Perhaps we should combine the ancient defensive matrices, suggested a Vorlian elder whose name Deho couldn't pronounce. The 17-layer shield configuration, combined with the pulse bombardment sequence. It took us 900 years to perfect this combination. Ralmoth nodded slowly. A wise suggestion. We shall implement it at the next infected zone. Deho shifted in his seat. He had been listening for 3 hours while species after species presented tactics that all shared one fatal flaw. They were all predictable. The scourge was designed to counter logical military thinking, and these beings were offering it exactly what it expected. If I may speak, Deho said quietly. The chamber fell silent. Several delegates turned to look at the human section, with expressions ranging from curiosity to mild annoyance. Ralmoth's eyes narrowed. The human delegation wishes to address the council? The reptilian commander made no effort to hide his skepticism. Your species has been part of this council for only 80 years. We are discussing warfare strategies that predate your entire civilization. Deho stood, feeling the weight of centuries of judgment pressing down on him. I understand, Commander. But I believe that might be exactly why you should listen. A ripple of surprised clicks and hisses moved through the chamber. No one spoke to Ralmoth with such directness, especially not someone who would be considered a child by most galactic standards. You have something to teach us about warfare? Thexun's tone carried the edge of ancient authority. What battles has humanity won that compare to our thousands of years of military history? None, Deho admitted. But we've also never lost to the scourge. That got their attention. It was true. The scourge had avoided human colonies so far, focusing on older, more established civilizations. Some theorized humanity was simply too young, too scattered to be worth the effort. The Scourge adapts to your strategies because they're predictable, Deho continued. Every formation you've mentioned, every tactic you've perfected over centuries, they all follow logical patterns. The Scourge reads patterns, like we read books. Ralmoth's claws scraped against the podium. Are you suggesting that our accumulated wisdom is a weakness? I'm suggesting that the Scourge expects wisdom. It expects perfected tactics. It expects you to use what works because you've spent hundreds of years proving it works. Deho pulled up his own display, showing combat footage from human military exercises. It doesn't expect chaos. The footage showed human soldiers, all young, most barely 20 years old. They moved in patterns that made the elder species uncomfortable. No formation lasted more than minutes. Tactics changed mid-battle. Weapons were used in ways that violated every standard military doctrine. This is disorder, a Morphean delegate said with disgust. Your warriors have no discipline, no refined strategy. Exactly, Heejin spoke up, standing beside Deho. The Scourge can't adapt to what it can't predict. Our soldiers don't follow ancient playbooks. Most of them barely finished training before deployment. They improvise constantly. Improvisation is the refuge of the unprepared, Ralmoth declared. Wars are won through careful planning and time-tested methods. Deho took a breath. Commander, with respect, you've been using time-tested methods for months. How many worlds have you saved? The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush atmosphere. No one spoke to Ralmoth that way. The old commander's eyes flashed with anger. But beneath it, Deho saw something else. Recognition. The painful acknowledgement of failure. What are you proposing, human? Thexun asked carefully. Let us try our way, Deho said. Give us one infected world. We'll deploy teams using our methods. Young volunteers. Minimal training. Maximum creativity. If we fail, you've lost nothing you weren't already losing. If we succeed, maybe you'll consider that sometimes the newest ideas work better than the oldest ones. The chamber erupted in debate. Species that had been allies for millennia argued among themselves. The concept was insane, sending untrained youth against an enemy that had destroyed veteran armies with centuries of experience. It went against everything they believed about warfare, hierarchy, and the value of accumulated knowledge. Ralmoth raised one massive claw for silence. The chamber obeyed instantly. Your proposal is foolish, he said, fixing Deho with an intense stare. It violates every principle of military engagement. It shows disrespect for the experience that has protected this galaxy for eons. He paused, and something shifted in his ancient eyes. But we are desperate, and desperation requires us to consider even foolish options. Deho felt his heart racing but kept his expression calm. You will have your chance, young human. One world, one deployment of your chaotic, undisciplined youth soldiers. Ralmoth leaned forward. When they fail, and they will fail, humanity will accept standard galactic military doctrine. Agreed? And when they succeed? Deho asked. Ralmoth's laugh was dry and humorless. If your children somehow defeat what our greatest warriors could not, then perhaps this old reptile will finally admit that the universe still has lessons to teach him. The vote passed by the narrowest margin in Council history. Humanity had permission to try something that every species with actual military experience considered suicide. As the session ended and delegates filed out, Heijin leaned close to Deho. You know they expect us to fail, right? They're giving us permission just so they can say they tried everything. Deho nodded, watching Ralmoth's massive form disappear through the chamber doors. I know. That's why we can't fail. We have to show them that sometimes the answer isn't in ancient wisdom. Sometimes you need someone too young to know it's impossible. No pressure then, Heijin said with a slight smile. None at all, Deho replied. We just have to prove that humanity's greatest strength is exactly what they think is our greatest weakness. Outside the chamber, stars glittered in the darkness. indifferent to the struggles of the species beneath them. Somewhere out there, the scourge continued its relentless advance, consuming worlds with the patience of a force that had no concept of time. And somewhere else, young humans prepared to show an ancient galaxy what youthful recklessness could accomplish. The human carrier ship Times, indomitable Times, hung in space above the quarantine zone like a defiant fist. Inside its assembly bay, 400 young humans gathered, and not one of them looked like a proper soldier by galactic standards. Minho stood among them, trying not to let his nervousness show. At 19, he had spent more hours commanding virtual armies in competitive games than sleeping. His team had won the Global Strategic Championship 3 months ago. Now, he was being asked to apply those skills to actual warfare, with actual lives on the line. The transition from pixels to reality made his hands shake. "Listen up!" Heijin's voice cut through the chatter. The young military advisor stood on a raised platform, her uniform still crisp despite having worked for 18 hours straight. "I know what you're thinking. You're thinking this is insane. You're right. It is insane." Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. These weren't soldiers. They were students, artists, athletes, gamers, and mechanics who had volunteered when humanity's government put out the strangest recruitment call in history. No military experience required. In fact, military experience was almost discouraged. They wanted young people who thought differently, who hadn't been trained into predictable patterns. Jiwoo sat cross-legged on the floor, reviewing xenobiology texts on her tablet. The 21-year-old had dropped out of university the moment she heard about the mission. Her professors had called her brilliant but unfocused, always asking questions that didn't fit into neat academic boxes. Now, those questions might save lives. She had spent the voyage studying the limited data on the scourge, looking for patterns in how it adapted. "The scourge learns from your tactics," Heijin continued. "Every species that fought it used military doctrine, perfected strategies, logical approaches. The scourge adapted to all of them. Our advantage is simple. We're going to use tactics that make no logical sense." Sunho raised his hand. The 18-year-old engineer had been building illegal racing drones in his parents' garage since he was 12. He had been arrested twice for dangerous modifications and unauthorized flight paths. Now, the military wanted exactly that kind of creative rule-breaking. "So we just do random stuff and hope it works?" Sunho asked. "Not random," Heijin corrected. "Creative, different, unprecedented. You'll work in teams of 20. Each team gets basic equipment and one rule. Never use the same tactic twice." Murmurs spread through the assembly bay. Never use the same tactic twice? Most military training emphasized repetition, muscle memory, practiced maneuvers. This was the opposite of everything warfare was supposed to be. Yoonji leaned against the wall, arms crossed. At 20, she had been studying art at Seoul National University, specializing in installation pieces that made people uncomfortable. Her final project before dropping out had been a sculpture garden that rearranged itself every hour, ensuring no viewer ever had the same experience twice. The military recruiters had seen her portfolio and immediately flagged her file. "What about losses?" someone called out. "What happens when we mess up?" The bay went quiet. Heijin's expression softened. "We're going into combat. Some of you won't come back. I won't lie about that. But conventional forces had 80% casualty rates against the scourge. We're hoping our approach keeps it under 15%. Our team, 15%. 60 people out of this room might die." Minho felt his stomach turn. "In games, you respawned. Here, death was permanent." Daeho entered the bay through the side door, accompanied by a massive figure that made everyone turn. Ralmoth had to duck to fit through the human-sized entrance. The ancient Vorlian commander surveyed the assembled volunteers with barely concealed disapproval. "These are your warriors?" Ralmoth's voice rumbled like distant thunder. "They look like hatchlings. They're volunteers. Deho said calmly. And they're about to prove that youth is an advantage, not a weakness. Ralmoth moved through the crowd. The young humans parted nervously. The commander stopped in front of Minho, staring down at the teenager with 800 years of judgment in his eyes. You are a soldier? Ralmoth asked. I'm a gamer, Minho answered honestly. Strategy games. Mostly. Real-time tactics. The Vorlian's expression was unreadable. War is not a game, young one. No, sir, Minho agreed. But games taught me something useful. When you use the same strategy too many times, good players counter it. The best players are the ones who adapt, who create new tactics on the fly. Ralmoth was silent for a long moment. Then he turned to Deho. You truly believe this will work? I believe that every conventional approach has failed, Deho replied. The scourge beats experience. Maybe it can't beat inexperience. The old commander looked around the bay once more. His gaze settled on Yunji, who met his eyes without flinching despite the height difference. What is your specialty, human? Ralmoth asked her. Art, Yunji said. I make things that don't make sense. Things that force people to see the world differently. And you think this will help you fight? Unji shrugged. The Scourge is essentially a really advanced problem-solving machine. Right? It encounters a problem, analyzes it, adapts to solve it. But what if the problem doesn't make sense? What if there's no logical solution? Because the whole scenario is deliberately illogical. For the first time, Ralmoth's expression shifted. Not quite respect, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. Foolish, he muttered. Completely foolish. He turned and headed for the exit. At the door, he paused. I will be watching from the command ship. Try not to die too quickly. After the Vorlian left, the tension broke. People started talking again, some joking to cover their nerves. Heijin began organizing them into teams, matching different skill sets and personalities to create groups that would think in diverse ways. Minho found himself teamed with Sunho, Jiwoo, and 17 others. Their skills ranged from parkour to cooking to music production. On paper, it made no sense as a military unit. That was exactly the point. All right, team, Minho said, surprising himself with how steady his voice sounded. Let's figure out how we work together. Sunho, what can you build with standard military equipment? The young engineer grinned. What do you need? Weapons? Tools? Toys? All of it, Minho replied. Jiwoo, what have you learned about the Scourge's adaptation patterns? Jiwoo pulled up her notes. It adapts faster to tactics it recognizes. Military formations, standard weapon deployments, logical assault patterns. It takes longer to adapt to things it hasn't encountered before. So we need to do things it's never seen, Minho said. Things that seem stupid or pointless. Things that are art, not war. Unji added, joining their group. She wasn't assigned to their team, but no one stopped her. The whole operation was breaking rules anyway. Over the next 72 hours, the Time's indomitable times became organized chaos. Teams practiced not by repeating drills, but by deliberately doing something different every time. Sunho and other engineers modified equipment in ways that would make military technicians cry. Weapons were combined with entertainment systems. Shield generators were reconfigured into completely different devices. Standard tactical gear was painted bright colors for no practical reason. Jiwoo collected samples of every material on the ship, testing how they might interact with the Scourge based on her theoretical models. Some ideas seemed promising. Most seemed insane. She kept all of them. Minho organized coordination systems, using gaming clan structures instead of military hierarchy. Teams could request help, share resources, or coordinate without rigid command chains. It was messy and informal, and drove the traditional military advisors to distraction. Heijin watched it all, with a mixture of pride and terror. She had convinced Deho this could work, but seeing it in action made her question everything. These weren't trained soldiers. They were kids playing at war. But then she remembered the battle reports from conventional forces. Decades of military experience, crushed in hours. Perfect tactics, perfectly countered. Maybe playing at war was exactly what they needed. On the third day, Deho assembled everyone for final briefing. Tomorrow we drop to Tarsus 7. 20 teams, 400 volunteers. The Scourge has controlled that world for 6 weeks. Every attempt to retake it has failed. He paused, looking at all those young faces. You're not going down there to be heroes. You're going down there to survive by being unpredictable. Help each other. Trust your instincts. And remember, the moment you start thinking like a soldier, the Scourge wins. Think like gamers, artists, engineers, students. Think like humans. Minho lay in his bunk that night, unable to sleep. Tomorrow was real. Tomorrow people might die, and he would be partially responsible for their tactics and decisions. In games, he had led thousands of virtual soldiers to victory. This was different. His tablet chimed. Messages from his team, unable to sleep either. They shared ideas, jokes, and fears. Slowly, something shifted in Minho's mind. These weren't just teammates. They were friends, collaborators, partners in the strangest experiment humanity had ever attempted. Maybe that was the real advantage. Elder species fought with discipline and hierarchy. Humans fought with friendship and crazy ideas. He sent one message back to the team. Tomorrow, we show the galaxy what happens when you let kids play with military equipment. Let's make it count. 20 affirmative responses came back immediately, each one different, each one uniquely human. In the command center, Ralmoth watched the preparations and shook his ancient head. Madness, he said, to no one in particular. Maybe, Deho agreed from beside him, but it's our madness, and sometimes that makes all the difference. The dropship shook violently as it punched through Tarsus 7's atmosphere. Minho gripped his harness, watching his team's faces in the red emergency lighting. Some looked excited, some looked terrified. Most looked both. Through the viewport, he could see the planet below. Once, Tarsus 7 had been home to 3 million Vorlian colonists. Now, it was a wasteland, covered in the metallic darkness of the Scourge. The nanoswarm moved across the surface, like living oil, consuming everything organic and adapting to every threat. 30 seconds to drop zone, the pilot announced. Good luck down there. Try not to break my ship. Sunho laughed nervously, checking the modified equipment one last time. He had spent the voyage turning standard military gear into something that defied explanation. Their weapons could switch between 6 different firing modes. Their sensors had been combined with music players. Nothing worked the way it was supposed to, and that was intentional. Remember the plan, Minho said, though calling it a plan felt generous. We hit the ground, assess the Scourge response, and then do whatever feels right. No repeating tactics, no standard formations. That's a terrible plan, one teammate said. I know, Minho replied with a grin. Isn't it great? The dropship doors opened, and 20 young humans jumped into a war zone. They landed in what used to be a Vorlian farming district. The buildings were half consumed. Their organic components dissolved while metal frameworks stood like skeletal remains. The Scourge covered everything, a writhing carpet of nanoparticles that seemed to watch them with alien intelligence. Contact in 3, 2. Jiwoo's warning was cut off as the Scourge surged forward. The team opened fire with standard plasma rifles. The Scourge recoiled from the initial barrage, particles scattering and reforming. But even as they fired, Minho could see it adapting. The nanoswarm was learning the weapon signatures, adjusting its defenses. Switch now, he ordered. Sunho triggered his modification. The plasma rifles suddenly started firing compressed air mixed with frozen coolant. The Scourge hadn't seen that before. Ice crystals formed across the nanoparticles, slowing their movement. It worked for exactly 45 seconds. Then the Scourge adapted, generating heat to counter the freezing effect. Next, Mingyu called. Unji threw something that looked like a paint grenade. It exploded in brilliant colors across the Scourge. The nanoparticles seemed confused, trying to analyze whether this was an attack or not. That hesitation gave the team time to reposition. It's slowing down when we do weird stuff, Jiwoo observed, taking readings with her modified scanner. Look at the adaptation rate. When we use normal weapons, it counters in seconds. When we do something illogical, it takes almost a minute. Across the planet, 19 other teams were discovering the same thing. The communication network Bauman had designed lit up with reports. Every team was trying different approaches, and the Scourge was struggling to adapt to 20 different tactical styles simultaneously. One team was using sonic weapons made from modified speakers, blasting music while they fought. Another had turned their shield generators into magnetic pulse emitters. A third was literally throwing rocks before shooting, creating confusion about which attack was the real threat. Minho's team encountered their first real challenge when the Scourge formed itself into a solid mass, blocking their path to the evacuation zone. It was learning to anticipate their movements, cutting off escape routes. Standard military doctrine says we flank it, Sunho said, studying the formation. So we do the opposite. Minho replied. We go straight through. Jiwoo. What happens if we feed it confusing data? The xenobiology student thought for a moment, then smiled. Let's find out. She activated every sensor, scanner, and communication device simultaneously, flooding the area with electromagnetic noise. Then she started broadcasting random data, everything from cooking recipes to music files to mathematical equations. The Scourge mass wavered. Its particles were trying to analyze the information, looking for tactical meaning in recipes for kimchi and instructions for assembling furniture. Now, Mingyu ordered. They charged straight through the confused nanoswarm, weapons firing in random patterns. Half the team was singing, not because it helped, but because Unji suggested it might confuse the enemy. It did. They broke through and reached their objective, a supply cache that conventional forces had abandoned. But the real discovery came when Unji stopped to create graffiti on a wall. What are you doing? Sunho demanded. We need to move. Wait, Jiwoo said, watching her scanner. Look at the Scourge behavior near the art. The nanoparticles were approaching Unji's graffiti slowly, cautiously. They seemed hesitant, as if unsure how to classify something that was neither threat nor resource. It was just art, existing for no tactical purpose, and the Scourge couldn't figure out how to respond. It doesn't know what to do with beauty, Unji said quietly. It's designed to fight, adapt, and survive. But art? Art doesn't fit into those categories. Minho immediately shared this discovery across the network. Within minutes, teams were incorporating art into their tactics. Someone was building sculptures from debris. Another team was painting patterns on their armor. It wasn't much, but every moment of Scourge hesitation was a moment humans stayed alive. The real breakthrough came 6 hours into the operation. Minho's team was pinned down in a collapsed building, surrounded by Scourge forces that had finally started adapting to their chaos. They were running out of ideas and ammunition. We need something completely new, Minho said, desperation creeping into his voice. Something the Scourge has never encountered. Jiwoo looked at their remaining resources. Standard military supplies, some of Sunho's modifications, and random items they had scavenged. Nothing seemed useful. Wait, she said suddenly. What if we combine everything in ways that make no sense? Not just different tactics, but actively contradictory ones. Explain, Minho said, watching the Scourge slowly advancing on their position. The Scourge adapts to threats by analyzing them logically. Weapon type, delivery method, tactical purpose. But what if we give it weapons that contradict themselves? Jiwoo started pulling together equipment. Sunho, Can you make a device that attacks and defends simultaneously? Crom said. The engineer's eyes lit up. That's stupid. It would cancel itself out. Exactly. 20 minutes later, they had created something that should not exist. A weapon that fired ice and heat at the same time. A shield generator that also broadcast attack signals. Armor that was simultaneously camouflaged and painted in bright colors. They deployed it, and the scourge stopped completely. Its particles gathered, trying to analyze the contradictory data. Was it a weapon? A shield? A decoy? The answer was yes, no, and maybe, all at once. The nanoswarm attempted to adapt, but every time it countered one aspect, another aspect contradicted that counter. It was stuck in a logic loop, unable to resolve the paradox. It's working, Jiwoo whispered in amazement. The scourge can handle new things, but it can't handle things that contradict themselves. Minho shared this breakthrough across the network. The response was immediate. Teams started creating paradoxical tactics, fighting while retreating, attacking with defensive maneuvers, using weapons as tools and tools as weapons. By the end of the first day, all 20 human teams were still operational. Conventional forces had never lasted more than 6 hours on Tarsus 7. The young volunteers had survived 18 hours, and they were learning faster than the Scourge could adapt. On the command ship, Ralmoth watched the battle reports with growing disbelief. He had commanded armies for centuries. He had studied every major conflict in galactic history. Nothing had prepared him for what he was witnessing. They are fighting with children's games, he said, watching one team use synchronized dancing as a tactical formation. They are turning warfare into performance art. And it's working, Heijin replied, unable to keep the pride from her voice. Casualties are at 3%. Conventional forces lost 80% by this point. Dex-Un observed from her station, compound eyes processing data faster than any human could. The Scourge adaptation rate is decreasing. It is encountering more unique tactics than it can efficiently counter. This should not be possible. Deho stood beside the ancient strategists, watching his people fight in ways that defied every military tradition. They were sloppy, undisciplined, and completely illogical by standard measures. They were also winning. Commander Ralmoth, Deho said quietly, do you still think we sent children to die? The old Vorlian was silent for a long time. On the screens, Minho's team was now combining music, art, contradictory weapons, and what appeared to be a cooking demonstration into a single combat approach. It was absurd. It was chaotic. It was effective. I think, Ralmoth said slowly, that I am watching something I did not believe possible. Your children are teaching the Scourge that youth and inexperience can be deadlier than age and wisdom. Down on Tarsus 7, Minho gathered his exhausted team. They had been fighting for 20 hours straight, and every one of them was still alive. Bruised, tired, and running on adrenaline, but alive. We're making a difference, he told them. Every weird idea, every stupid tactic, every piece of art we create, it all buys us time. The Scourge can't keep up with us, because we don't even know what we're going to do next. Yoonji was already spray painting another wall. Sunho was modifying equipment into something that probably violated physics. Jiwoo was collecting Scourge samples while humming a song. They were kids playing at war, and somehow, impossibly, they were winning. The Scourge adapted to logic. It learned from patterns. It countered experience with cold efficiency. But it had never encountered humans who fought like they were making it up as they went along. Because they were. The emergency council session had been called after 6 days of impossible reports from Tarsus 7. Representatives from 12 species gathered once again in the Keras 9 chamber. But this time the atmosphere was different. Confusion had replaced certainty. Ancient assumptions were crumbling. Ralmoth stood at the podium, and for the first time in his 800 years, he seemed uncertain. The human forces have held Tarsus 7 for 144 hours. Our best units could not maintain position for more than 6 hours. The holographic displays showed combat footage that made no sense to military minds trained over centuries. Human teams danced while fighting. They created art installations in the middle of battle zones. They used weapons in ways that contradicted their own design specifications. And somehow, they were still alive. Thexun clicked forward, her ancient mind struggling to process the data. We have analyzed over 5,000 distinct human tactics used on Tarsus 7. No tactic has been repeated. This violates every principle of effective warfare. Perhaps that is precisely why it works, suggested a Morphean elder tentatively. Deho sat in the human section, exhausted, but vindicated. Beside him, Heijin monitored real-time communications from the planet below. The teams were tired, running low on supplies, but their casualty rate remained impossibly low at just under 7%. The Council demands an explanation, Ralmoth said. Only genuine need to understand. How are your untrained youth succeeding where our greatest warriors failed? End. Deho stood and walked to the central display. He pulled up comparative analyses that Jiwoo had compiled from the battlefield. The Scourge is essentially an advanced artificial intelligence designed for warfare. It learns from encounters, adapts to threats, and counters tactical patterns. Every species here has fought it using refined military doctrine, perfected over generations. He highlighted sections of the data. The Scourge adapted to Vorlian tactics in 4 hours because those tactics followed logical progressions. It adapted to Gralic strategies in 3 hours because your formations are mathematically precise. It adapted to Morphean siege protocols because those protocols have been standardized for centuries. And human tactics? Thexun asked. We don't have tactics, Deho replied. Not in the traditional sense. We have organized chaos. The Scourge can't adapt because there's nothing consistent to adapt to. He showed footage of Unji's team. They were using fireworks as weapons. Not because fireworks were effective, but because the Scourge had never encountered fireworks in combat. It had spent precious seconds analyzing whether the bright lights and noise were dangerous, and in those seconds, the humans had moved to a better position. Another clip showed Sunho's team deploying paint balloons before plasma strikes. The paint served no tactical purpose, but the Scourge wasted processing power, trying to determine if the paint was biological warfare, chemical attack, or marker for orbital bombardment. This is not warfare, a Vorlian general protested. This is children playing dangerous games. Yes, Heijin spoke up. And that's exactly why it works. The Scourge was designed to counter military thinking. It wasn't designed to counter creativity, improvisation, or play. Ralmoth studied the footage in silence. One clip showed Minho's team performing synchronized movements that looked more like performance art than tactical formations. But every movement confused the Scourge's predictive algorithms, buying precious seconds for attack or retreat. But why the young? Asked a Gralic scientist. Surely experienced soldiers could also improvise. Deho pulled up neurological data that human researchers had compiled. This is where it gets interesting. Human brains develop in stages. Between ages 18 and 25, our brains are optimized for creative problem-solving, risk-taking, and novel thinking. After that, our brains gradually shift toward pattern recognition and established knowledge. He showed comparative scans. Older humans, like older members of your species, excel at applying proven solutions. They draw on experience and refined techniques. But young humans excel at creating completely new solutions to problems they've never seen before. You are saying your youth are effective because they lack wisdom? Thex Un's tone suggested she was trying to understand, not criticize. We're saying they're effective because they lack preconceptions. Deho corrected. Every human generation reinvents things because they don't automatically respect the old ways. To you, that seems like a flaw. Against the Scourge, it's our greatest strength. A new voice joined the discussion. Bauman appeared on a communication screen from orbit around Tarsus 7. The 19-year-old communications specialist looked exhausted, but excited. Council members, I've been coordinating our team's tactical sharing. I need to show you something. He pulled up network analysis. We've created a real-time idea sharing system. When one team discovers something that works, they share it across the network. But here's the key. No other team uses that exact tactic. They modify it, combine it with other ideas, or use it as inspiration for something completely different. The display showed a web of interconnected innovations. One team's discovery about art, confusing the scourge, had inspired another team to use music. That musical approach had inspired a third team to create rhythmic attack patterns. Those patterns had led to someone else experimenting with synchronized movements. Each idea spawned variations, never exact copies. 400 humans are essentially brainstorming weapons in real time, Bauman continued. The scourge can't keep up, because we're generating new tactics faster than it can process them. Ralmoth looked at the data, then at Deho. This is not how warfare is conducted. No. Deho agreed. This is how humans solve problems. We throw ideas at the wall, see what sticks, and build on what works. It's messy and inefficient by your standards, but against an enemy that counters efficiency, maybe mess is exactly what we need. The chamber fell into contemplative silence. Centuries of military tradition were being challenged by 6 days of chaotic success. We must vote, Thexun said finally. The question is whether to expand human deployment to other infected worlds. The vote was not unanimous, but it passed. 3 more worlds would receive human youth teams. 12,000 volunteers aged 18 to 25 would deploy within 48 hours. But as the council prepared to adjourn, alarms sounded. Hagen's expression shifted from triumph to concern as new data flooded her displays. The scourge is changing, she announced. On Tarsus 7, adaptation rates are increasing. It's learning meta-patterns from our chaos. Deho felt his stomach drop. Explain. Jiwoo's voice came through from the planet's surface, tight with worry. It stopped trying to counter specific tactics. Instead, it's learning to expect the unexpected. It's creating predictive models for unpredictability itself. The holographic displays showed the shift in scourge behavior. It was no longer trying to adapt to individual tactics. It was adapting to the concept of constant change. How long before it fully counters your approach? Ralmoth asked. Unknown, Hagen replied. But casualties are starting to increase. We went from 7% to 12% in the last hour. The council members looked at each other with growing alarm. The human approach had worked, but the scourge was evolving to counter it. The enemy was learning to fight chaos with chaos. We need something bigger, Deho said quietly. Not just different tactics, but a fundamentally different approach to the entire conflict. On the surface of Tarsus 7, Minho gathered his team in a partially collapsed building. They could all feel the shift. The scourge was responding faster now, anticipating their improvisation. It's learning to think like us, Sunho said, checking his equipment. That should be impossible. It's artificial intelligence, Jiwoo replied. If it can learn military tactics, it can learn creative tactics too. We just gave it 6 days of intensive training in human-style warfare. Unji leaned against a wall, exhausted. So what now? We can't out-chaos an enemy that's learned to expect chaos. Minho thought about his gaming career. The tournaments where he had faced opponents who adapted to his style. The matches where conventional strategies stopped working. There was always one solution when your opponent learned to counter your creativity. We need to coordinate something massive, he said slowly. Something so big and complex that even if the scourge expects it, it can't process it all at once. Like what? Someone asked. Before Minho could answer, Bauman's voice came through their communications. All teams, listen up. Council has authorized full deployment. 12,000 more volunteers incoming. We're about to scale this operation up dramatically. Across the 4 infected worlds designated for assault, young humans began deploying. Artists, gamers, engineers, students, musicians, athletes. None of them traditional soldiers. All of them carrying humanity's strangest weapon, the ability to think in ways no one else expected. Ralmoth watched from orbit, his ancient mind struggling with conflicting thoughts. These humans were children by galactic standards, barely old enough to be considered adults by their own species. They had no business being in combat zones. Yet here they were, holding ground that veteran armies could not, fighting with methods that violated every military principle he had spent centuries mastering. "What if we have been wrong?" he said quietly to Thexun. "What if age and experience are not always advantages?" The Gralic strategist clicked thoughtfully. "Our civilizations have valued wisdom for millions of years. The concept that youth could be superior in any context is difficult to process. But the data does not lie," Ralmoth replied. "These young humans are effective precisely because they are young. They have not learned to think like us. They have not been trained into predictable patterns. They're Ralmoth." He pulled up casualty comparisons. Human teams, 12% losses. Traditional galactic forces in similar situations, 80% losses. The difference was undeniable. "Perhaps," Thexun said carefully, "we have something to learn from species whose members do not live long enough to gather true wisdom." Ralmoth nodded slowly, a gesture he had learned from humans. "Perhaps the universe is teaching old species a very uncomfortable lesson. Sometimes the answer is not in ancient knowledge. Sometimes you need someone too young to know it is impossible." On Tarsus 7, Minho looked at his team. They were all thinking the same thing. The Scourge was adapting to their chaos. They needed something unprecedented. "Get ready," he told them. "Because we're about to show the galaxy what 12,000 creative humans can do when they all work together." Grassonans. Quote, 12,000 young humans stood ready across 4 infected worlds. The Scourge had learned to expect their chaos, but it had not anticipated the scale of what was coming. Bauman coordinated from his station on the Time's indomitable asterisk, surrounded by displays showing all 600 teams. The 19-year-old had created something unprecedented, a communication network that allowed 12,000 people to share ideas instantly, without creating predictable patterns. "All teams. This is coordination," Bauman announced. "We have a problem. The Scourge has adapted to our adaptation. It's learning meta-patterns, expecting us to be unpredictable. So, here's what we're going to do." He paused, making sure everyone was listening across 4 different worlds. "We're going to do 12,000 different things at exactly the same time." Silence filled the communication channels. Then someone laughed. Then everyone was talking at once, excited and terrified in equal measure. Jiwoo had made the critical discovery 3 hours earlier. Deep beneath Tarsus 7's surface, the Scourge maintained central processing nodes. These nodes coordinated the nanoswarm's adaptation across entire continents. Every time the Scourge encountered a new tactic, it sent data to these nodes. The nodes analyzed the information and distributed counter-strategies back to the swarm. "It's like a brain," she had explained to the council. "Individual Scourge particles are just cells. The nodes are what make them intelligent. If we can overload the nodes with more information than they can process, the whole system breaks down." Thexun had immediately understood the implication. You would need to present thousands of unique tactical approaches simultaneously. The computational load would be, impossible for any normal military force. Heijin had finished. "But we have 12,000 humans who specialize in doing impossible things. Now, across 4 worlds, those 12,000 prepared for the largest coordinated improvisation in human history." Minho stood with his team on Tarsus 7, reviewing their assigned role. "We're Team 47. Our job is to be completely different from Teams 1 through 46, and Teams 48 through 600. No pressure. Sunho had converted their remaining equipment into something that looked like it belonged in a museum of modern art. I have created a device that deploys holographic projections while simultaneously releasing smoke, playing music, and firing completely random weapons bursts. I have no idea what it does. 10. Perfect, Minho said. The Scourge will have no idea either. Across the communication network, 600 team leaders coordinated their unique approaches. One team was preparing synchronized swimming movements in portable water tanks. Another was setting up percussion instruments made from military equipment. A third was building temporary architecture that served no defensive purpose but looked beautiful. Unji's team had created an installation piece they called War as Performance. It involved colored lights, interpretive dance, and weapons fire timed to musical beats. By any military standard, it was absurd. That was exactly the point. Operation Cacophony launches in 10 minutes, Bauman announced. Remember, the goal is not to be random. It's to be uniquely yourselves. Every team should do what only they can do. Be creative. Be weird. Be human. On the command ship, Ralmoth watched the preparations with a mixture of awe and horror. 847 years of military experience had not prepared him for this moment. He was about to witness either the most brilliant tactical operation in galactic history or the most spectacular failure ever recorded. This is madness, he said to Deho. Yes, the human diplomat agreed. But it's organized madness. There's a method to it. I cannot see the method. That's because you're looking for conventional patterns. This isn't conventional anything. The countdown began. Across 4 worlds, young humans took their positions. Some were shaking with fear. Others were laughing with nervous energy. All of them understood the stakes. 60 seconds. Jiwoo rechecked her calculations. The Scourge nodes could process approximately 8,000 tactical variables per minute under normal circumstances. If they could present more than that simultaneously, the nodes would bottleneck, slowing adaptation across the entire swarm. 40 seconds. Heijin reviewed casualty predictions. Even with their unconventional approaches, losses could reach 30% in an operation this large. That meant nearly 4,000 young humans might not survive the next few hours. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on her. But there was no other option. 20 seconds. Minho took a deep breath. His team was ready. Their approach combined gaming tactics, performance art, improvised engineering, and pure absurdist theater. It made no logical sense. Neither did most of human history. 10 seconds. Across the galaxy, the elder species watched. They had granted humanity this chance because desperation left no alternatives. Now they would witness whether youth could triumph where age had failed. 0. Operation Cacophony began. 12,000 humans attacked simultaneously across 4 worlds. The Scourge encountered a wall of unprecedented chaos. Minho's team deployed Sunho's device. Holographic dancers appeared while smoke filled the air, music blasted from speakers, and weapons fired in patterns that corresponded to classical compositions. The Scourge tried to analyze it. Were the holograms decoys? Was the smoke chemical warfare? Did the music serve a tactical purpose? Before it could conclude, Unji's team launched their performance piece. Colored lights strobed across the battlefield, while humans danced between weapons placements. They threw paint grenades that created temporary art installations. They sang folk songs while deploying military-grade explosives. Every team was different. One used cooking demonstrations to distract the Scourge while setting traps. Another built elaborate domino chains that triggered weapon systems. A third team was playing chess on a giant board, while their moves corresponded to tactical positions. The Scourge processing nodes began receiving data faster than they could analyze it. Holograms, dance, music, art, games, cooking, theater, architecture, sports, poetry. 12,000 unique approaches flooded the system. Jiwoo watched her instruments. The adaptation rate is dropping. The nodes are bottlenecking. Across the communication network, the same reports came in. The scourge was slowing down, its nanoparticles becoming less coordinated as the central processing struggled to keep up. All teams, press the advantage, Bauman ordered. Keep doing what you're doing. Stay unique. The battle became a celebration of human creativity. Teams discovered that the more absurd their tactics, the more effective they were. The Scourge's artificial intelligence had no framework for understanding actions that served no obvious tactical purpose. Why were humans building sculptures mid-battle? Why were they dancing? Why were they playing musical instruments? The nodes tried to find military applications for these actions, and failed, wasting precious processing time. Sunho's team reached the first Scourge node. It was buried beneath what used to be a municipal building, pulsing with alien intelligence. Standard military doctrine would suggest careful demolition or targeted strikes. Instead, they held a concert. Sunho had modified their equipment to produce specific sound frequencies. Combined with Unji's art installations that used reflective materials, and Minho's team coordination that timed everything to musical beats, they created a multi-sensory assault that the node couldn't classify. Was it sound warfare? Visual disruption? Psychological tactics? The node's processing slowed to a crawl, trying to analyze data that made no logical sense. Then Jiwoo deployed her secret weapon, Genuine Curiosity. She approached the node, not as an enemy to destroy, but as a phenomenon to understand. She took readings, asked questions, and treated the encounter like a scientific experiment that happened to involve explosives. The confusion this caused in the Scourge's processing was almost beautiful. It didn't know how to respond to curiosity. Everything in its programming dealt with threats, tactics, and warfare. But this young human was studying it like a fascinating puzzle. In that moment of confusion, they destroyed the node. Across Tarsus 7, similar scenes played out. Teams approached nodes in 600 completely different ways. Each approach confused the Scourge just long enough to succeed. On the second infected world, a team defeated their node by playing children's games around it. They jumped rope, played tag, and tossed balls while gradually surrounding the node with explosives. The Scourge could not process play as warfare. On the third world, a team used meditation circles. They sat peacefully around the node, appearing to do nothing, while actually setting up a complex trap that activated the moment the Scourge lowered its defenses in confusion. On the fourth world, a team literally painted the node with bright colors before destroying it. The act of beautifying an enemy installation before its destruction created processing errors the Scourge could not resolve. 18 hours into Operation Cacophony, all major Scourge nodes had fallen. Without central coordination, the nanoswarm became disorganized, easier to contain and eliminate. The casualty report came through. 847 humans lost. Just over 7% of the deployed force. On the command ship, Ralmoth stared at the numbers in disbelief. Impossible. Such an operation should have resulted in at least 80% casualties. But it didn't, Heijin said quietly, tears streaming down her face. 847 young people were gone, and each loss hurt. But 11,000 had survived, and 4 worlds were being reclaimed. Dexyun reviewed the tactical data. We must document this. The Council must understand what occurred here. What occurred, Daeho said, is that humanity proved our greatest weakness is our greatest strength. We don't have centuries to perfect our tactics. So we improvise. We don't have time to learn from all our mistakes. So we try crazy ideas and see what works. He pulled up footage of the operation. Humans dancing, creating art, playing games, all while defeating an enemy that had crushed galactic military forces with ease. You all thought we were sending children to die. We were actually sending humanity's most powerful weapon. Youth, who don't know enough to be afraid of impossible odds. Young people who haven't learned that you're supposed to fight wars with ancient doctrine. Ralmoth approached Daeho, and for the first time, the ancient Vorlian bowed his head to a human. I was wrong. I called you foolish. I called your volunteers children playing at war. I was blind. You weren't blind, Deho replied gently. You were wise, and wisdom is valuable. But sometimes you need someone too young to know better. Someone who looks at an impossible problem and says, let's try something stupid and see what happens. The Galactic Council convened in emergency session. Representatives from 12 species watched the recordings of Operation Cacophony. They witnessed warfare transformed into art, military operations that looked like festivals, and tactical genius that violated every principle they held sacred. We propose a new doctrine, Thex-Un announced. When conventional approaches fail, when wisdom proves insufficient, we request human youth volunteers. We designate this the Human Protocol. The vote was unanimous. Additionally, the Council created a permanent position, the Voice of Inexperience, a seat reserved for humans aged 25 or younger, who would provide perspective that experience could not match. On Tarsus 7, Minho sat with his surviving team members, exhausted and triumphant. They had done the impossible by not knowing it was impossible. We won, Sunho said in disbelief. We actually won. We survived, Jiwoo corrected. Some didn't. We need to remember them. Unji was already planning a memorial installation, something beautiful to honor those who had fallen. We'll make something that captures what we did here. Not a monument to victory, but to creativity, to youth, to the idea that sometimes the best solution is the one that makes no sense. Ath, Bauman's voice came through the communication network one last time. All teams, the Council has confirmed. 4 worlds reclaimed. Scourge infrastructure destroyed. And humanity is now officially the galaxy's go-to problem solvers for impossible situations. Cheers erupted across the communication channels. 12,000 young humans, who had changed warfare forever, celebrated in 12,000 different ways. Months later, Minho found himself back on Earth, trying to readjust to normal life. He was 20 now, already considered too old for the frontline creative chaos that had won the war. New teenagers were being recruited, younger minds ready to tackle problems in ways no one could predict. He had been offered a position at the military academy, teaching conventional forces how to think unconventionally. It was strange, trying to create doctrine for doctrinal-less warfare. Deho visited him at the academy. The diplomat was 28 now, officially aging out of the youth programs he had championed. Do you ever think about it? Minho asked. How we won by being young and stupid. Not stupid, Deho corrected. Creative, unburdened by experience, free to try things that older, wiser beings knew were impossible. And now we're becoming those older, wiser beings. Yes, Deho agreed. But we're also creating systems to ensure the next generation gets their chance. We learned something the elder species forgot. Every generation needs to remake the world in their image. That's not a flaw. It's humanity's greatest feature. Far across the galaxy, Ralmoth looked up at the stars from his home world. 900 years old now. Ancient even by Vorlian standards. He thought about the young humans who had taught him the most important lesson of his long life. Wisdom had value. Experience mattered. But sometimes, the answer to an impossible problem was to give it to someone too young to know it was impossible, then step back and let them surprise you. He had learned to respect humanity not despite their youth, but because of it. In a galaxy of ancient species who moved slowly, thought carefully, and perfected everything over centuries, humanity raced forward with reckless creativity. And sometimes, that made all the difference. The Scourge had been designed to counter wisdom. It had never encountered youth, used as a weapon. Now, across the galaxy, whenever civilizations faced unsolvable problems, they knew who to call. Not the oldest, not the wisest, not the most experienced. They called the young humans who were too inexperienced to know better, too creative to follow rules, and too optimistic to accept impossible odds. They called the ones who treated warfare like art, tactics like games, and impossible challenges like interesting puzzles. They called humanity's youth, and the universe learned to be grateful for species whose greatest strength was knowing they still had everything to learn.